Hello, ladies and gentlemen, as always, I'm your host, Airsoft Al, the common man's Airsofter who reviews media so you guys can check it out and decide whether or not you want to read it, watch it, or listen to it. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we take a look at, of course, another challenge that Murc has decided to take on from the many pitch meeting videos I've done, and that is, of course, Gate Bioshock, or how a Bioshock Gate story could work. Too long didn't read. A gate opens up in either Rapture or Columbia gets transported somewhere. There you go. That's the challenge. So, what did Murc do? Well, Murc decided, hey, I'll take a scene from Bioshock Infinite that actually would make sense, and in this case, he decides to take Columbia to 1984. And for those of you who don't know about 1984, I ain't talking about the George Orwellian book. No, I'm talking about 1984. Ronald Reagan had just beaten his Democrat opponent in a landslide re-election, mind you. The year of not only We're Not Gonna Take It by Twisted Sister coming out, but also the year of Red Dawn, great movie by the way, Terminator, Footloose, and even Ghostbusters. The year that just would be synonymous with the 80s. The 1984, even before with 1983, with Dio's Holy Diver coming out, 84 was the year that the 1980s officially kicked off. And let me tell you now, this, ladies and gentlemen, this is definitely going to be interesting, because 1984, in terms of just how one can have a lot of fun with that, 1984 was the year where military technology, especially just firearms in general, was definitely taking off. And sadly was also the year of the assault weapons ban from Ronald Reagan. That did not go out until 1994, which was the year I was born. So yay, I'm a end of the assault weapon ban era baby. But, ladies and gentlemen, you're probably asking, okay, how does this relate to the essentially possibly curb stomping that's going to happen to Columbia? Well, that's where things get kind of fun, because, which we will get to, actually, before I even get to why I love the 1980s in terms of military technology, let's actually get to the story itself. So, the story itself is essentially Columbia, through some weird means, shows up in the midsection of the United States, primarily in Kansas. Because if you look at the map of the path that Columbia takes, it will definitely show up in Kansas. And that basically puts the entire U.S. on high alert, thinking that, oh my god, the Ruskies have actually launched the missiles, even though, technically speaking, by the 1980s, especially by Reagan's presidency, we were on very amicable terms with the Russians. In fact, the Russians were slowly starting to come out as the bad guy in terms of the American zeitgeist. We weren't as afraid of communism, or at least as, hardcore afraid of communism as we were from the 50s to the 60s to even the early on 70s. I mean, don't get me wrong, the fear of communism was still there, but it was more along the lines of what was going on down south. The 1980s was more along the lines of the drug fuel era, especially with the cartels and even China. So, again, the Russians a little bit more favorable to a degree, but not to the extent of, oh, hey, yeah, no, we like communism. I mean, hell, Gorbachev and Reagan were kind of buddy-buddy. So, essentially, what was going on is that Reagan is now on the hotline, or at least, not really the hotline, more or less on a direct call with the Kremlin, and they're basically being told, no, we did not launch any nukes, we did not launch any ICBMs, nor did China. Nice little fun fact here. China and Russia, even after the Sino-Soviet war that happened on their border back in '69, relations did not exactly become friendly until way later on after the Cold War. So, technically speaking, the only real friendly country that still liked the Soviet Union at the time was North Korea, and even then, they were more friendly to China. So, yeah. Again, there's a lot of cool stuff in the 80s that a lot of people don't really understand in terms of politics, or at least in terms of personality-wise. And believe me, there's a lot of stuff that can be said about China in the 1980s. Believe me on that. But, ladies and gentlemen, getting off track. So, of course, they scramble. And when I mean scramble, I mean this is what they've been training for. Because, again, the 1980s was the era where the F-15 and even the F-16 would be kings of the skies, especially the Harrier jet. Which, believe me when I say that, I know that didn't come around until like the 90s, but even then, I still find it hilarious that Pepsi tried selling off a Harrier jet in the 90s. Oh my god. If you haven't seen that documentary on Netflix, go watch it. It's actually kind of fun. But, in all seriousness though, the F-16 and the F-15 would become kings of the skies. And while, yes, technically speaking, the F-4 Phantom was still technically around, it wasn't exactly around in terms of a strategic fighter role, or at least in terms of, oh hey, yeah, no, this is here now. By this point, they're slowly phasing out the F-4 Phantom. Now, the big thing, though, is that they are basically sending out a lot of fighter wings. I'm talking as many of their closest bogey as possible. All civilian air traffic is grounded, from the smallest of basically podunk town airports that have crop dusters to the largest of international or even regional airports. And air traffic controllers are basically being told you are to basically work with the U.S. Air Force until such time that you basically go back to your civilian duties. By this point in time, everyone is now wanting a positive ID, or at least a positive visual, on this SOB. And they get it. At 15,000 feet, the 3rd Squadron, or at least one of the squadrons, literally almost hit Columbia. And they are literally reporting in, hey, there's a floating city in the sky. And by this point in time, it is basically, no, yeah, no. They're basically being told, all air wings are being told to stay within visual range of this thing, track it, and basically report anything that happens with it. And again, this is where, again, this is before the era of, like, instantaneous communication. In fact, in 1984, the first Apple computer was released. But again, this was the era where the internet was literally dial-up. Even pre-dial-up. So, again, instantaneous communication, not a thing yet. So they would literally have to land the planes, take the footage from not only the gun camera, but even the cockpit camera, send it off to Langley, i.e. the CIA headquarters, have it analyzed out of the best possible photos they've got out of that sucker, analyze it, put it in a packet, send it to the president to basically, in the Situation Room, which is exactly what happens. They basically send it off to the president, President Reagan, in the Situation Room, and is basically reporting exactly what's going on with his entire cabinet. But at this point in time, everyone now knows what they're looking at, or at least they think they do. So the next step is to get a positive ID on this thing, which means they're going to be sending up spy planes, or at least reconnaissance planes, with better camera equipment to actually take clear photos, or even full-on video of this sucker. While at the same time attempting to keep civilian aircraft away from the bogey. Essentially, anything that is around Columbia is now military operations, as in no civilian aircraft is allowed within spitting distance of this thing at 15,000 feet. But that's not all. In the city itself, Fink is shitting his pants, because as much as he knows that, yes, he could make a lot of money from this, he knows that him and his brother are going to be lynched as soon as they become seen as thieves and basically carpetbaggers. And that's exactly what they're going to be. They're going to basically be seen as con men. So they have to try and basically get on top of this. Daisy Fitzroy sees this as a means to help the people, to help the Vox Populi, and we'll get into that in a bit. And from, of course, that, It's how it is. Elizabeth, of course, while not seeing in this chapter, I can imagine she actually sees these people and is doing everything she can to try and be seen from her ivory tower. Nice little fun fact. The eyes are actually the windows, and there actually is a skylight above. However, the eyes are the windows, which are just tinted to where no one can see in, but can be seen out. Skyline, however, not tinted. You could look basically directly down on that sucker, meaning that if she figures out that the eyes, that they cannot see through the eyes, they can at least see through the skyline, meaning that she would basically do everything she can to try and get them to be seen, or at least be seen from above. And again, this gets better. This gets a lot better, because Comstock, after of course being tormented by the twins, who he believes he killed, even though it's impossible because the twins in Bioshock Infinite are essentially Schrodinger's cat, alive and dead. And I could get into that, but I don't want to, because I want to gush a little bit more about the 1980s. And why, while yes, Columbia has vigors and stuff, could put up at least a little bit of a fight against the United States in 1984. Now, why is that? Well, here's the thing. In the 1980s, we were starting to really evolve past, or at least away from the Vietnam era level equipment. We were definitely getting a lot more equipment there, definitely a lot more good stuff. We were definitely getting the goodies, especially in terms of the M16. You see, in the 1980s, we basically went away from the M16A1 with its many upgrades and went to the M16A2, which was a heavier barrel, a longer buttstock, meaning that this buttstock right here was a little bit longer, which means that not only are you getting this sort of musket, quoting Grantham, this musket-style length, but you essentially had no recoil. The heavier barrel, and even if you had an M203 on the front of that sucker, you basically had no recoil, meaning that you could effectively get shots down range. And even if you had the thing on full auto, which sadly the M16A2 did not have full auto, it had 3-round burst, a mechanical 3-round burst, and to anyone who actually understands mechanical 3-round burst, you understand why it presented issues. But even then, a full-length rifle like that, even with the Colt Commando, or at least, again, what would be the M4 carbine at the time, would definitely be kind of giving them an advantage in terms of not only precision shooting, but also close-quarter combat. We still had the basic M870, we had basically the good shotguns still, especially the Ithaca. We still had the Ithaca in the armory, at least by this time, and we weren't phasing out with the Benelli until the Marines at least didn't phase out for the Benelli until at least a little bit after the 90s. Again, I may be wrong on that. I am fallible to error. Equipment, military equipment even, also another thing. We were, by this point, actually looking for a new replacement for the Huey chopper, meaning that the Black Hawk has not been introduced yet, but it was being considered. I mean, if you actually look at the helicopters from the 1980s that were being considered to be given to the U.S. military to replace the Huey, even though the Huey is venerable, it is the workhorse, it is one that I still love and many a veteran has a soft spot for, especially those of us who love the old girl and what she has done and what she has given for her country. The other thing is that during the 1980s, we were actually phasing out the Willys Jeep for the Humvee. And I mean this, even by 1984, there were still a lot of Jeeps and not enough Humvees. Now, yes, I could be wrong on that because, again, I basically, before even doing this video, before even doing this review, I had to look a little bit, and even, again, we had a lot of Jeeps, as in a lot of surplus Jeeps, and apparently not a lot of Humvees at the time. So, again, I could be wrong or I could be right, I don't know. I'm getting a lot of conflicting information. So, basically, you have just, yeah, and even any configuration, basically. It's one of those things. The biggie, of course, is the sidearm of the United States military. Because the 1980s was the era where the Beretta M9 was definitely trying to find its place in the world. The Beretta M9 was the gun that was basically, it was the era of the Wonder Nines. If you want to learn more about that, go check out Forgotten Weapons Wonder Nine playlist, or look at someone who has created the Wonder Nine playlist that talks about all the handguns that were basically going into the trials to replace the venerable 1911 with a 9mm handgun that would, of course, in time be the Beretta M9, or at least the 92 FS. Now, the other thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that the 1980s was a time of tanks, or at least different types of tanks that were definitely, again, it was the era where the Abrams would come into being and actually came into service. So, again, it is one of those, again, I just love the 1980s. I really do. The 80s is a fascinating era, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, if you guys want to talk about the 1980s or gush about in the comments section, you can. But again, this is that era where basically Colombia may have a chance with its vigors, but the United States would definitely give it a good fight. Now, I have talked with Murc, and he has basically stated that, yes, technically speaking, he is considering going through a first contact scenario before doing a war. Here's the thing. And this is just from me playing the game a lot religiously. Anyway, basically saying in the most plain sense possible, first contact would basically be an ambush. Because, and this is the thing, Comstock has basically brainwashed a good portion of the population into believing that the Sodom below is literally been corrupted by the devil, etc., religion, religion, religion. And basically, anything that comes up from below is either the false shepherd or something else entirely. Only those like Fink, or at least like Daisy Fitzroy, know the truth. And that, if the federal government does come back, then Colombia will essentially be seen as a state in revolt. And that is essentially what it is. Colombia is a state in revolt. It is a state that has uprisen and is completely ignoring the federal government. Meaning that, unlike, of course, the government at the time in the 19-teens, where any sort of insurrection would have been met with harsh, literally harshness. Granted, of course, we also, Athens, Tennessee was also a thing, but moving on. In this case, as soon as the representative, be it a woman, a man, or any sort of ethnicity, touches down in Colombia, it could basically be a GTA Vice City situation where at first they're being polite to each other, and then all hell breaks loose. Now, another thing they could do, of course, is maybe one of them has a rocket launcher, or at least has one of the vigors, that they launch at the chopper that they came on and destroy it, basically cutting off their means of escape. Except for when the Vox Populi comes up, opens fire on Colombia, and immediately gets the representative out to one of their safe houses and fills them in on exactly what is going on, and they fill them in on what is going on as well. And again, this is where a lot of fun can be done, because the weapons of Colombia is essentially their take on a lot of the more popular guns. Be it from the M2 carbine, for those of you who don't know what the M2 carbine is, the M2 carbine is, of course, the select fire version of the M1 carbine, to many others, especially the Mauser broom handle, or even, of course, the Colt Navy revolver, and even, of course, a weird combination of a Mauser and a 1903 Springfield, I think. Again, it's a lot of the weapons are very interesting, to say the least, especially the Winchester 1887, or at least their version of a Winchester 1887. But again, it is a, how can one go forward with this? Because while, yes, technically speaking, a combat scenario with Colombia, especially with all of its quote-unquote military might, would definitely be a, yes, the U.S. would lose men, but Colombia would lose a lot more. And technically speaking, Ronald Reagan, or at least in this case, it could be seen as a state emergency, or at least as an emergency, as a state in revolt. Meaning that, technically speaking, the state of Colombia has forfeited its constitutional rights as a state, and now federal forces are allowed to go in and operate within that state to bring it a rebellious and insurrectionist state back under federal control. Again, I'm not really all more of a law person. I am more or less of a, hey, this is the overview type thing. So if you guys want to go more in depth in the comments section and talk about how the U.S., especially the United States government in the 1980s, or specifically 1984, has the legal right to basically bring Colombia back into the fold, kicking and screaming, via active duty military forces, then please let me know in the comment section down below. And sound off in the comment section down below, of course, your thoughts in terms of the technology and weapons of the 1980s, especially in 1984. Because Murc could use all the help he can get because he has set himself up a challenge, and it's up to us, those who love the 1980s, to help him out. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I've been here, Self-Dal, and I shall see you lovely, lovely people in the next video. And again, for those of you who want to take this challenge, look at my playlist videos for pitch meetings and take on the challenge I have presented in those. Dead serious. Till next time. Later.